Hi, I'm Sarah Sharp and I love paper piecing. So foundation paper piecing is probably one of my favorite techniques in quilting, and I especially love using very deliberate fabric choices within my designs to really emphasize certain motifs and elements. So just to give you an example of what I'm talking about, behind me here we have what's called the hiss quilt, and you can see that I've isolated some different letters up here near the snake's mouth, so it spells out hiss all the way along. Just below we have some striping where we've used some very deliberate fabric choices by grabbing onto the linear quality of those prints instead of just cutting them at random. We've really focused on, following along with the natural lines in the fabric and then incorporating them into these areas of the quilt. Now, don't worry, we're not going to be doing anything quite this intricate this afternoon, but I think you could do it. Instead, we're going to just take a look at the midsection of the snake, how we have these geese down here, and I've drafted a nice little block that measures at 5 inches using those same striping details for us to walk through this technique today. So foundation paper piecing, you're sewing on a foundation. Here on the table, we have our foundations. Now these two that I have in front of me are identical, except that one of them I've sewn through the lines, which are going to be our sew lines, except I've done it without any thread in my machine at about a 3.5 stitch length, just because the back of the paper can sometimes be a little daunting when it's blank. This perforation gives us a nice tactile element, so it feels like, we're not quite as blindfolded as we would be with a just blank back of the paper. Some other things about this pattern, we have our numbers. The numbers indicate the piecing sequence, so we're going to place the first piece where it says number 1, the second piece with number 2, and so on and so forth. And then the final thing about this pattern is that this block measures exactly 5 inches square, and there's no seam allowance accounted for on this particular template. So all we want to do is that we want the fabric to extend 1/4 inch past all the outer edges of our paper as we're going. All right, now that we've talked about this pattern kind of very specifically, what we want to do is, just look at it from a little bit of a bird's eye perspective. I have a nice big strip section here, a skinny strip, a little pointy triangle at the top, and then we've got this nice base. So when I went about figuring out what fabrics I wanted to use in this design, I knew I wanted to emphasize the point at the top. I wanted to get a nice chunky linear print in here. So I'm going to go ahead and show you what I've picked for area 1. And now this is a little bit wrinkly, so we just want to make sure that when we're working with this intentional piecing that we really capture that we just want to make sure that everything's nice and flat. So we're just going to give it a little spritz here, because if we have wrinkly fabric, then it's not going to play as nicely with what we're trying to do. Okay, so as I'm looking at this print, my eye's really drawn to this nice graphic dark chevron. So if this were a printed fabric with a right side and a wrong side, this would be right side down. And then we're going to have our pattern with the right side up, our printed side up. And we're just going to place it, and you can see right within that section we capture that chevron. So I'm just going to go ahead, I'm going to pick everything up, I'm going to try to keep it all together, and I'm just going to take my scissors and I'm going to cut a very generous seam allowance all along the outside. And I tend to cut about 3/8 of an inch to sometimes even 1/2 an inch. And the reason I do that is because I don't want to have to get out my seam ripper too much, and so I find that by sewing with a little bit extra seam allowance, it's just a little bit more forgiving, and it makes the process go more smoothly. All right, so we have our first piece cut, and then I've gone ahead and pre-cut the rest of the pieces. And so here we have a nice ABC print, so we can tell that it's right side down and that we're looking at the back because our letters are backwards. And we are going to place that piece of fabric down so that we can capture those ABCs right there. And now this might be a little bit different if you've paper pieced before, because we, right now both of our fabrics are right side out. So I'm gonna just keep everything together very carefully. I'm gonna pinch it with my fingers, lift it up so that the printed side of the paper's down. And now I'm just gonna kind of carefully turn it so that, remember this black and white was area 1, the ABCs are area 2. And so I want area 2, the area that I'm adding, to be the closest to me. And then I'm just gonna gently lift the edge of the paper. So I've got, you can see the paper, area 2, all of it. And I'm gonna find that sew line. And then I'm just going to crease along this line right there. And if you want, you can use a tool to just get a nice crisp crease. And then what's gonna happen is when I fold back this paper, here I have that generous, you know, I don't know, maybe it's even 3/4 inch seam allowance. And then tucked under the second piece, I have the seam allowance for that. Now, because we're paper piecing, the seams have to go in a very specific direction, otherwise it's not gonna work. So even though if you were just piecing templates, it could go one way or the other, it has to go on this side right now. And now we're ready to sew this piece together. So we're gonna go over to the machine. And I'm using a stitch length of about 1.5 to 1.8. 8's my lucky number, so that tends to be where I wind up. And I'm just gonna sew along the line, just like that. And now, when we go back over to the light board, what we see is that within this section, this fabric's winding up exactly where we thought it was going to. So I'm gonna give this a little press. Okay, so now you can see how we got this piece of fabric right where we wanted it, and I've sewn everything up here. So you can see that I went on to add some little, a very small linear print. I have this triangle that I've isolated to really focus on this point in the pattern. And I think that that's given it, you know, just a little something extra that you might not necessarily get if you were to just piece without necessarily paying as much attention to what fabric was winding up where. Now over here, earlier I'd mentioned the perforated template. If you don't have a light box, that's totally fine. I use my window all the time, or a light, the overhead light in my sewing room, to try to hold it up to see where my fabrics are going. This also works really well because, as you can see here, if we just take this ABC fabric, we can feel where that seam line is going to be, so we know, okay, that this is going to wind up in the right spot. And just taking a look at, you know, some of these others, these other fabrics, you know, it's just a matter of taking a look at the fabrics that you have to choose from, thinking about what design elements in your pattern you want to focus. It's not always, you know, stripes and triangles. Maybe it's, you know, a really dark part of, you know, a bird that you're paper piecing and you're like, wow, I really wish that I could have, you know, something special there. And so I hope that, you know, this has given you a new perspective on how to look at your prints and of different things that you might be able to do with them by just taking a little bit of extra time to pre-cut your pieces in a very deliberate way. And I hope this is a technique that you might try.